I remember the exact second my mother decided to turn her wedding into my humiliation, and it happened under a chandelier so bright it made everything look more perfect than it really was. She grabbed my wrist without warning, her fingers tight enough to feel deliberate, and pulled me across the ballroom floor like I was part of the performance she had been rehearsing all night. "You have to meet my boss," she said, her voice polished, loud enough for the people around us to hear. I barely had time to react before she tilted her head toward me, smiling in that way that always meant something calculated was coming. "This is my failed child," she added, as if she were introducing a joke she expected everyone to understand. There was a pause, just long enough for the words to land, and then the laughter came, soft at first, then spreading across the table like it belonged there. My father stepped in beside her, adjusting his cufflinks, his tone casual, almost amused. "It's embarrassing to even have a child like that," he said. And just like that, I wasn't a person anymore. I was context, a comparison, a way to make her look better. Then everything stopped. Not because of what they said, but because of who was listening. Her boss had been smiling seconds earlier, mid-conversation, but now his expression changed in a way I couldn't ignore. His eyes locked onto mine, scanning my face like he was trying to confirm something he didn't trust. The color drained from his features, and the air around us shifted, quieting in a way that didn't belong at a wedding. "Hello," he said slowly, his voice tight with disbelief. "I didn't expect to see you here." The laughter died instantly. Conversations around us faded into a silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. In that moment, I realized something didn't match. He wasn't reacting to the insult. He was reacting to me. And whatever he saw when he looked at me, it didn't align with the version of me my family had just presented. If you've ever been reduced to a label by the people who were supposed to know you best, you understand how quickly the ground can shift under your feet. But what I felt in that moment wasn't just humiliation. It was confusion layered with something sharper. Because his reaction wasn't sympathy. It was recognition. And recognition doesn't come from nowhere. I didn't say anything. I didn't defend myself. I just stood there, holding a glass I had already forgotten about, trying to make sense of why the only person in that room who didn't laugh was the one person who seemed to know something I didn't. My mother recovered first, of course. She always did. "You must be confusing her with someone else," she said lightly, waving her hand as if the moment could be dismissed just by changing the tone. My father nodded along, eager to restore whatever version of reality they were comfortable maintaining. Around us, people followed their lead, conversations slowly restarting, laughter returning in fragments like nothing had happened. But the shift had already occurred. I could feel it. Not in the room, but in the space between what was being said and what was actually true. I stepped back after that, not making a scene, not giving anyone more reason to look at me. I moved toward the edge of the room, blending into the background the way I always had, except this time it felt different. Not like I was disappearing, but like I was observing, watching the same pattern play out in real time. My mother moving from group to group, collecting compliments, reinforcing her image. My father supporting it quietly, filling in the gaps where needed. It was a system. One I had grown up inside without fully understanding how it worked. Standing there, I realized something I hadn't let myself acknowledge before. This wasn't just about how they saw me. It was about how they needed others to see me. Because if I wasn't the failure, then her success didn't stand out the same way. If I wasn't diminished, then she wasn't elevated. And that meant my role had never been accidental. It had been assigned, maintained, reinforced every time I chose not to challenge it. But none of that explained him. The way he had looked at me, the way his voice had shifted when he spoke, that didn't fit into the system I understood. That was something else, something outside of what my family had built. And for the first time that night, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not even embarrassment, just a quiet, growing question. What did he see that they didn't? I didn't stay long after that. I waited until the attention moved elsewhere, set my glass down on a passing tray, and slipped out of the ballroom without saying goodbye. The hallway outside was quieter, the air cooler, the noise of the reception fading behind closed doors. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle, replaying the scene in my head, not the words, but the reaction. His reaction. Because that was the only part that didn't follow the script I had known my entire life. At the time, I thought it was just an interruption, a moment that didn't belong. I didn't realize it was the beginning of something else entirely. Because by the next morning, that single sentence would stop being a detail I couldn't explain, and start becoming the reason everything that came after would finally make sense. The next morning, I woke up with the same dress still hanging over the back of my chair and the faint echo of last night's laughter still sitting somewhere in my chest, refusing to leave. My phone was already buzzing on the nightstand, lighting up with notifications from social media I hadn't opened yet. When I finally picked it up, the screen filled with photos from the wedding, polished, filtered, perfectly framed versions of an event I knew hadn't felt that seamless in real time. My mother stood at the center of nearly every image, radiant, composed, exactly the way she had always wanted to be seen. My father was beside her in most of them, smiling in that restrained way that suggested approval without ever needing to say it out loud. Guests leaned in, glasses raised, faces angled toward the camera like they understood they were part of something important. I scrolled slowly, taking in the details, the lighting, the angles, the way everything had been curated to look effortless. And then I noticed what wasn't there. Me. Not in the background, not blurred at the edges, not even half-cropped out of a group shot. It was like I had never been in the room at all. The only trace of my existence came from a tagged comment buried under one of the photos. Someone joking about that awkward moment with the daughter, followed by a string of laughing emojis that felt a little too familiar. I didn't respond. I didn't even hover long enough to consider it. I locked my phone and set it back down, letting the silence of my apartment fill the space instead. On paper, my life didn't look like a failure. I lived alone just outside downtown Boston in a place I could afford without depending on anyone else. I ran my own freelance marketing strategy work, taking on clients who needed structure more than they needed recognition. Restaurants, small brands, startups that were close to collapsing but didn't know why. I built systems, fixed inefficiencies, rewrote campaigns that weren't performing. It wasn't glamorous, and it didn't come with titles that impressed people at dinner tables, but it worked. It paid my bills. It kept me independent. And more importantly, it gave me control over something my family had never fully understood. In my family, success had a very specific definition. It had to be visible, measurable in ways that could be shared in conversation, displayed through job titles, office locations, or the kind of lifestyle that translated well in photos. My mother had built her entire identity around that idea. Victoria Clark, the woman who could walk into any room and immediately establish her place in it. She didn't just succeed, she curated success. Every detail, every introduction, every story she told about herself was designed to reinforce that image. My father followed her lead, supporting the version of reality that kept everything aligned. And in that version, I was the outlier, the one who didn't fit. That narrative hadn't changed when she called me 3 months before the wedding. I still remember the way her voice sounded on the phone, controlled, but with something underneath it she couldn't fully mask. Stress. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ease into the conversation. She went straight to the problem. There were issues with the wedding planning. Contracts that didn't align, vendors pushing back, timelines slipping. She didn't say she needed help. She framed it like she was giving me something to do, a chance to be useful. I said yes without asking too many questions, partly out of habit, partly because I already knew what would happen if I didn't. The event would fall apart, and somehow that would still reflect back on me. What she called a few issues turned into something much larger once I started looking at the details. The venue contract had a penalty clause buried in the fine print that would trigger if payments were even slightly delayed, and the schedule they had set made that almost guaranteed. The catering agreement included variable pricing tied to guest count changes that hadn't been finalized, leaving room for unexpected increases. The florist had quietly adjusted their quote upward, assuming no one would compare it to the original estimate. And the entertainment company hadn't received their deposit, which meant they were already considering another booking for the same date. None of it had been handled properly. It had been pushed forward under the assumption that everything would somehow work itself out. I stepped into it the way I always did, quietly, without drawing attention to the fact that there was a problem in the first place. I renegotiated the venue terms, pushing back on the penalty clause and restructuring the payment timeline to remove the risk entirely. I went back to the catering team with adjusted numbers and forced them to honor the original pricing agreement. I secured the entertainment slot by wiring a deposit from my own savings when my mother told me she couldn't move funds quickly enough. By the time I finished, I had spent just over $8,000 of my own money to stabilize an event that everyone else would later describe as flawless. She never asked how it got fixed. She never asked what it cost me. The only acknowledgement I received was a short message that said, "I knew you'd handle it. You're good at that kind of thing." That kind of thing. The work that stayed invisible, the kind that made everything look effortless for someone else. Standing in that ballroom the night before, listening to her introduce me as her failed child, I realized it wasn't just a careless insult. It was a continuation of the same pattern. My contribution only mattered if it supported her image, and even then, it wasn't something that needed to be seen. Sitting in my apartment that morning, I replayed the past 3 months in my head, not with frustration, but with a kind of clarity I hadn't felt before. Because the more I thought about it, the more one detail refused to settle into the narrative I was used to. Not her words, not my father's agreement, but the way her boss had looked at me. That wasn't part of the system I understood. That was something outside of it, something that didn't align with the role I had been assigned. And for the first time, I started to consider the possibility that the version of me my family had been presenting to the world wasn't the only version that existed. By Monday, I forced myself back into routine, because routine was the only thing that still felt predictable. My office sat above a narrow coffee shop in downtown Boston, the kind of place most people walked past without noticing. The stairs creaked on the way up, the hallway smelled faintly like roasted beans and printer ink, and the space itself was just big enough for a desk, a whiteboard, and a shelf lined with old campaign binders. It wasn't impressive, but it was mine, and that mattered more than anything my family had ever valued. I sat down, opened my laptop, and started answering emails like nothing had shifted. Client updates, performance reports, timelines that needed adjusting. For a while, it worked. Numbers were consistent, systems made sense. There were no hidden meanings in metrics, but every time I paused, even for a second, my mind pulled me back to the same moment. Not my mother's voice, not the laughter, but his. "I didn't expect to see you here." It didn't sound like small talk. It sounded like recognition that had caught him off guard. I tried to dismiss it, to treat it like something incidental, but the more I replayed it, the less it fit into anything I could explain. Around mid-morning, there was a knock on my door. It was light, controlled, the kind of knock that didn't belong in a building like mine. Most people pushed doors open without thinking. They leaned in, spoke casually, treated the space like it was temporary. This was deliberate. I stood up slowly, walked over, and opened it. And just like that, the moment I had been replaying all morning stepped into the room. He stood there in the hallway, exactly as I remembered. Except now there was no crowd, no music, no distraction. Just him, holding a folder, his expression serious in a way that made it clear he hadn't come by accident. "Madison Clark?" he asked, even though he already knew. I nodded, still holding the door like I needed something to steady the moment. "Richard Hale," he said. "We met on Saturday." For a second, I considered telling him I was busy, that I had calls, deadlines, anything that would keep this from becoming real. But curiosity had already taken hold. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked into the office, his eyes moving across the space, taking in the details without judgment. The whiteboard covered in half-erased notes, the stack of folders, the quiet evidence of work that didn't need to be seen to function. Then he set the folder down on my desk and opened it. The document inside stopped me before I fully understood why. The layout, the formatting, even the way the analysis was structured felt familiar. My name sat at the top of the page, printed cleanly, unmistakably mine. But the date was wrong. Not recent, years old. I stepped closer, my focus narrowing as recognition began to settle into place. It was a strategy proposal I had written nearly a decade earlier, back when I was still taking on whatever work I could get, building case studies instead of careers. "I've been trying to confirm something since Saturday," he said, his voice calm, measured, and I needed to be sure before I came here. He tapped the page lightly. "You wrote this." The memory came back in fragments. A small agency on the edge of closing, a rushed timeline, a complete overhaul of their client acquisition strategy built in less than 2 weeks. I hadn't thought about it in years. It had been one project among dozens, something I finished and moved past without expecting it to lead anywhere. "That was you?" I asked quietly, more to confirm the connection than to question it. He nodded once. "That was me. And that document is the reason my company didn't shut down." He paused, watching my reaction, not expecting a response so much as measuring it. "We were weeks away from losing everything. I followed your framework, adjusted our positioning, rebuilt our offer, and landed a contract that carried us through the next year. Everything that came after started there." For a moment, the room felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward without actually moving. My work had always existed in the background of other people's success. I knew it had value. I just never expected to hear it said like that. Not directly. Not by someone whose entire company had been built on something I created and then forgot. "My family doesn't know any of that," I said finally, the words coming out more neutral than I expected. "They don't really ask." "I figured," he replied, his tone steady, almost matter-of-fact. "That's not why I'm here." He reached back into the folder and pulled out a second set of documents, placing them on the desk beside the first. The difference was immediate. These weren't strategy proposals or performance reports. They were internal records, financial summaries, audit notes, the kind of documents that didn't exist unless something had already gone wrong. "We've been running an internal audit for the past few months," he said. "Standard process after a structural expansion. But what we're seeing isn't standard." He met my eyes directly this time. "Some of the irregularities trace back to your mother." The shift from past to present happened instantly. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even as the question carried more weight than I wanted it to. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slid one page toward me. Expense discrepancies, budget reallocations that didn't align with original proposals, credit assignments that shifted after campaigns performed well. It wasn't enough to form a complete picture, but it was enough to see the outline of something that didn't belong. "At first, we thought it was a systems issue," he said, "a structural gap after the merger. But the deeper we looked, the more it started to look intentional." I leaned back slightly, letting the information settle without reacting too quickly. My mother had built her entire career on control, on making sure nothing slipped out of place that could damage her image. The idea that she could be connected to something like this didn't fit with the version of her she had spent years maintaining. But then again, neither had the wedding. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. There were processes for things like this, legal teams, compliance departments. None of them required me. "Because this isn't just about identifying the problem," he said. He tapped the first document again, the one with my name on it. "It's about fixing the system that allowed it to happen, and you've done that before." He paused, just long enough for the next part to land with the weight it carried. "I want you to come in as an external consultant, 6 months, full access, audit everything and rebuild it so this can't happen again." Then he said the number. $150,000. For a moment, it didn't register the way it should have. Not because it wasn't significant, but because of what came with it. Access, visibility, a chance to see something I had spent years standing outside of. "And my mother?" I asked quietly. "That process moves forward with or without you," he said. "Your role is to fix the system, not to protect it." He closed the folder slowly, leaving it in front of me like the decision had already been made, even if I hadn't said it out loud yet. "Take the time you need," he added, standing up. "But don't wait too long. Situations like this don't stay contained." When he left, the room felt quieter than it had before, but not in a comfortable way. The kind of quiet that comes when something has shifted and you can't move back to where you were. I sat there, looking at the documents on my desk, knowing that whatever I chose next wouldn't just change my work. It would change the way I understood everything that had come before. I signed the contract on Monday morning before I could give myself enough time to talk my way out of it. It wasn't a dramatic decision, just a quiet one that felt final the moment I hit send. By the time I arrived at Hale and Rowe's headquarters later that day, my access had already been approved, my credentials activated, and my role defined in a way that left no room for interpretation. I wasn't there to observe. I wasn't there to assist. I was there to examine everything. The building looked exactly like the kind of place my mother had spent years trying to belong to. Glass walls, clean lines, open workspaces designed to suggest transparency, while carefully controlling what was actually visible. People moved with quiet efficiency, conversations stayed low, and every detail reflected a level of order that felt intentional. But I had learned early on that the more polished a system appeared from the outside, the more likely it was compensating for something underneath. I checked in at security, received a temporary badge labeled External Strategy Consultant, and was directed to a conference room that had already been prepared for me. A laptop, a stack of initial reports, and a detailed access schedule sat waiting. No introductions, no explanation, just access. Richard stopped by briefly, long enough to confirm everything was in place. "Start where the patterns are least obvious," he said before leaving. "The surface has already been reviewed." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with a system that looked stable until you stopped trusting it at face value. I sat down, opened the laptop, and began with campaign performance data paired against budget allocation. At first glance, everything aligned. Revenue matched projections. Client retention was strong. The numbers told a story of consistency. But consistency doesn't always mean accuracy. When I layered that data against internal credit assignments and approval chains, small inconsistencies began to appear. Not enough to trigger alarms on their own, but enough to suggest movement that didn't follow the expected path. By the second day, those inconsistencies started forming patterns. Campaigns that performed exceptionally well often had credit reassigned late in the reporting cycle. Expense approvals for certain accounts bypassed standard review processes without triggering any flags. Budget reallocations looked justified in summary reports, but when traced back to their original proposals, they didn't align with the strategy they were supposed to support. None of it was chaotic. It was controlled. Small adjustments, repeated consistently, designed to redirect recognition and resources without drawing attention. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident. I avoided my mother's floor entirely during those first few days. Not out of hesitation, but out of strategy. If she knew I was there, if she understood the level of access I had been given, the system would adjust. Behavior changes when it's observed. Patterns disappear. Data becomes less reliable. So I focused on what couldn't be altered in real time. Archived records, historical approvals, communication logs that had already been locked into place. The deeper I went, the more consistent the structure became. And then I found something that didn't fit within the system at all. It started with an internal memo tied to expense structuring guidelines. On the surface, it looked standard. Companies often circulate internal recommendations on how to categorize certain types of spending to align with accounting frameworks. But the language in this document felt different, more flexible, less precise. It encouraged strategic classification of travel and wardrobe expenses in ways that made them easier to justify under client-facing activities. That alone wouldn't have been enough to raise concern, but the signature at the bottom did. My name. Not similar, not approximate, exact. Madison Clark, strategy consultant. For a second, I thought it might be something old, something I had written years ago that had been repurposed internally. But the timestamp didn't match, the formatting didn't match, and the context didn't match anything I would have ever recommended. I pulled the metadata, checking the creation time, the originating system, and the access logs tied to the document. It had been generated less than a year ago on a company workstation I had never used, on a floor I had never had access to. The email associated with it was almost identical to mine, off by a single character. Close enough to pass unnoticed, not close enough to hold under scrutiny. I leaned back, letting the implications settle without reacting too quickly. This wasn't just a system that had been adjusted. This was a system that had been prepared. Someone had created documentation under my name to legitimize actions that needed justification. That meant they understood the value of attaching credibility where it would be trusted, and they had planned for a situation where responsibility might need to be redirected. A fallback narrative built into the structure itself. That was when the message appeared, not in my email, not through any official channel, but as a direct note in one of the internal collaboration tools. No name, just a string of numbers where the sender should have been. Check the approvals tied to executive accounts. No greeting, no explanation, just a directive. I didn't respond, but I followed it. Tracing those approvals revealed another layer. Certain expenses that should have required multiple levels of authorization were being approved through shortened chains. The justification fields used the same flexible language from the memo I had just reviewed. Consistent phrasing, repeated across different accounts, designed to pass without question. And at the center of those approvals, not always directly but always connected, was my mother. Positioned in a way that allowed influence without immediate accountability. I closed the files slowly, not because I was overwhelmed, but because the structure was becoming clear in a way that couldn't be ignored. This wasn't mismanagement. It wasn't a system failure. It was a system that had been shaped over time to allow specific outcomes while maintaining the appearance of control. Credit could be reassigned. Expenses could be absorbed. And if anything came under scrutiny, there was already a framework in place to explain it. One that included my name. For the first time since I had stepped into the building, I understood what I was actually dealing with. I wasn't just auditing a company. I was stepping into a structure that had already decided what role I was supposed to play in its failure. And if I wasn't careful, that role would be assigned to me long before I had the chance to change it. By the end of the first week, the data stopped feeling like numbers on a screen and started feeling like something that had been quietly shaping my life long before I ever noticed it. I had spent days tracing patterns inside the company, following approvals, mapping out how credit and expenses moved through the system. But when I began digging into older records tied to legacy accounts, the structure shifted in a way I hadn't expected. What I found didn't belong entirely to the company. It extended beyond it, into timelines that felt uncomfortably familiar. It started with a flagged transaction labeled under an old category that had been absorbed during a merger. Most of the entries in that report were routine, internal adjustments, vendor payments, standard financial behavior that didn't require attention. But one line stood out because it didn't match the pattern. It referenced an external fund transfer categorized as educational allocation support. The wording itself was vague, but the reference code attached to it wasn't. I had seen that format before, not here, somewhere else. I pulled the record, cross-checked it against archived documents, and felt something tighten in my chest when the match came back. The account had originally been created under my name. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Similar naming conventions, overlapping identifiers, something that could be explained without jumping to conclusions. But the deeper I traced the transaction history, the less room there was for coincidence. Years ago, my grandfather had set up an education fund for each of his grandchildren. I remembered being told about it once, casually, like it was something I could rely on if I ever needed it. I never followed up. I worked through school, built my own income, convinced myself I didn't need anything that came with conditions. Looking at the records now, I saw exactly where that fund had gone. It hadn't disappeared. It had been redirected. The transfers moved in small amounts at first, then in larger increments, all categorized in ways that would pass routine review: professional development, travel expenses, networking costs. Individually, they looked reasonable. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed in one direction, toward accounts connected to my mother, toward the career she had been building during the same period I was figuring out how to build my own without support. It wasn't a single decision. It was a series of choices, made over time, structured carefully enough to avoid attention. I didn't react immediately. I sat there, looking at the screen, letting the information settle into something that didn't rely on emotion to make sense. This hadn't been done recently. It wasn't part of the current audit. It had been built into the foundation of everything that came after. And for the most part, it had worked. I hadn't noticed. I hadn't asked. I had accepted the version of events I was given and adjusted around it. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, a pattern that explained more than just financial movement. It explained the structure I had been placed inside without realizing it. I kept going, not because I needed more proof, but because I needed to understand the full scope. Additional records showed smaller transfers layered over time, all justified under categories that aligned with business expenses. Each one designed to look necessary, strategic, aligned with growth, and each one connected back to her. The consistency was too precise to ignore. This wasn't about survival, it was about allocation. A decision, repeated, that resources tied to me were better used supporting her trajectory. The message from earlier in the week came back to me then. Check the approvals tied to executive accounts. I reopened that thread and layered in the financial data I had just uncovered. The connection formed almost immediately. Certain approvals that had seemed procedural before now aligned with the timing of those external transfers. It wasn't just about moving money, it was about integrating it, folding external resources into internal systems in a way that made them indistinguishable from legitimate company funds. That required planning, timing, an understanding of how oversight worked and where it could be bypassed without triggering attention. My phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the rhythm just enough to pull me out of the data. I glanced at the screen. Victoria Clark. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "I heard you've been spending time in the building," she said without greeting. Her tone was controlled, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Awareness. "Consulting work," I replied, keeping my voice even. There was a pause on the other end, brief but deliberate. "For Richard?" she asked. "For the company," I said. She exhaled softly, the sound measured, calculated. "You should have told me," she said. "It would have been easier." Easier. The word sat there, undefined but heavy with implication. "I didn't think it was necessary," I replied. Another pause, shorter this time, sharper. "Be careful, Madison," she said. "You don't always understand the full context of what you're looking at." I looked back at the screen, at the transaction logs, at the patterns that no longer needed context to make sense. "I'm looking at the data," I said, "and the data doesn't need context to show patterns." The silence that followed was different, not controlled, not neutral. Then her voice shifted, just enough to register. Colder, more precise. "Systems are built by people," she said, "and people can be replaced." Then she hung up. I set the phone down slowly, replaying the conversation, not for the words themselves, but for what they revealed. That wasn't concern. It wasn't even defensiveness. It was control being challenged, and for the first time, she didn't know exactly how to respond to it. I turned back to the data, but the perspective had changed. I wasn't just tracing patterns anymore, I was mapping intent. Every transfer, every approval, every document tied to my name without my knowledge formed part of a system that had been designed not just to function, but to protect itself. And within that system, I had been positioned as both a resource and a fallback. Someone whose absence made it easier to use her name. Someone whose invisibility reduced the risk of immediate challenge. That version of me no longer existed. And the more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the system wasn't just vulnerable to exposure. It had already prepared for it. The only question left was whether I would let it follow the path it had been built for, or stop it before it could close around me. She chose the place the way she chose everything else, carefully, deliberately, with control built into every detail. The reservation came through her assistant, not from her directly, with a time that avoided peak hours and a table positioned far enough from the rest of the room that no one would overhear anything that mattered. When I walked into the restaurant, I already knew this wasn't a conversation. It was a move. She was seated when I arrived, posture straight, expression composed, as if nothing in her life had shifted at all. If someone had glanced over, they would have seen a mother waiting for her daughter, not a woman whose entire structure had started to crack. "You've been busy," she said as I sat down, her voice smooth, controlled, like she was opening a meeting rather than confronting something personal. It wasn't a question. It was confirmation. Information had reached her, filtered through layers of observation I hadn't yet identified. "I've been doing my job," I replied, matching her tone, keeping everything neutral. She studied me for a second, not searching for emotion, but for alignment, for any sign that I was still operating inside the version of reality she understood. "You should have come to me first," she said. "It would have saved a lot of unnecessary complications." There it was, the first adjustment. Not denial, not acknowledgement, just a reframing that suggested I had created a problem by not following the structure she expected. "I didn't think it was necessary," I said. Her gaze sharpened slightly, the smallest shift, but enough to signal that the conversation was moving out of the space she preferred. "You're looking at fragments," she said, lowering her voice just enough to separate this from the surface-level exchange. "Data without context can be misleading. You don't have full visibility into how those systems were built." "I have enough visibility to see patterns," I replied, "and patterns don't rely on interpretation." For a moment, she held my gaze, then leaned back, adjusting her approach without breaking composure. "Then let's talk about those patterns," she said, "because what you're seeing isn't misconduct, it's adaptation. Systems don't survive without flexibility. Decisions have to be made quickly, sometimes without perfect alignment. And attaching my name to documents I never wrote is part of that flexibility?" I asked. That was the first time I introduced something she hadn't brought up herself. She didn't react immediately, no visible surprise, no hesitation, which told me she had already accounted for the possibility that I would find it. "Your work has always been structured in a way that supports multiple applications," she said. "Using that structure internally was efficient. It maintained consistency across the system. It almost sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely." "You mean it gave credibility to decisions that needed it?" I said. The air between us shifted, subtle but unmistakable. She didn't correct me. She didn't deny it. She recalibrated. "You're stepping into something larger than you understand," she said. "And once you cross certain lines, it becomes very difficult to control the outcome." "I'm not trying to control the outcome," I replied. "I'm documenting it." That landed differently. I could see it in the way her expression tightened, not visibly but structurally, like something she relied on had just lost stability. "You've always been good at fixing things quietly," she said after a moment, her tone softening, shifting into something that almost sounded like praise. "That's your strength. You don't need to make this bigger than it is." There it was, the offer without being named. Keep it contained. Maintain the system. Don't expose what didn't need to be exposed. "And in return?" I asked. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice again. "In return, nothing changes," she said. "Your work continues. Your position stays intact. The relationships that matter remain unaffected. There's no reason to disrupt something that's already functioning. Functioning for who? I asked. She didn't answer directly. For the family, she said instead. For everything that's been built over time. Not everything can be understood in isolation. That structure didn't support me, I said. It used me. For a second, she looked like she might respond directly. Then she stopped. The pause stretched just long enough to confirm that the language she usually relied on wasn't going to hold here. You're interpreting past decisions through a limited perspective, she said finally. We made choices based on what was necessary at the time. It doesn't change what those choices were, I replied. The softness in her tone disappeared completely then. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was precision. If you continue down this path, she said, you're going to create consequences that extend beyond what you think you're addressing. I'm not creating anything, I said. I'm uncovering what's already there. Silence settled between us. Not uncomfortable, just final. The kind of silence that marks the point where a conversation stops being negotiable. She looked at me differently then, not as something she could adjust or redirect, but as a variable she hadn't fully accounted for. Once this moves forward, she said, her voice steady, controlled, colder than before. There's no version of this where things go back to the way they were. I know, I said. And I did. Not just in the context of the company, but in everything that came with it. The version of reality she had maintained for years wouldn't survive exposure unchanged. She stood first, smoothing out her jacket, composure fully restored on the surface. To anyone watching, it would have looked like a meeting that ended without conflict, but the structure underneath it had already shifted. She walked out without looking back. I stayed seated for a moment longer, not because I needed time to think, but because I needed to be sure of one thing. That I wasn't going to step back into the role she had built for me. The one who fixed things quietly. The one who absorbed consequences so everything else could remain intact. That role had never been mine. It had just been assigned to me long enough that I stopped questioning it. By the time I left the restaurant, the path forward wasn't just clear, it was irreversible. I stopped looking for answers and started building proof, because proof is the only thing that survives when everything else gets rewritten. The conversation at the restaurant didn't change my direction. It removed any reason to hesitate. I went back into the system with a different focus, not tracing patterns anymore, but locking them into a structure that couldn't be questioned or reframed. Every file I had flagged needed to align across independent sources. Every timestamp had to hold against system logs, access records, and external activity. It wasn't enough to know what had happened. It had to be undeniable. The memo with my name on it became the center of everything. I pulled the full metadata record, mapping its creation time against internal login logs and physical access data tied to employee keycards. The result was exact in a way that didn't require interpretation. The document had been created on a secured company terminal at a time when I was logged into a recorded client call through an external platform. 2 separate systems, 2 independent records, both confirming the same thing. I couldn't have written it. From there, I expanded outward. Expense approvals linked to that memo followed the same structure, language repeated, justifications aligned, authorization paths shortened in ways that bypassed oversight without triggering alerts. And every path led back, directly or indirectly, to my mother's level of access. I compiled everything without commentary. No conclusions, no emotional framing. Just data layered in a way that allowed anyone reviewing it to follow the sequence without needing explanation. Screenshots paired with logs, transaction histories aligned with approval chains, communication threads placed alongside system activity. It wasn't written to convince anyone, it was written to withstand scrutiny. When I sent it to Richard and the compliance team, I didn't add anything beyond a subject line. Within hours, the response came back. A formal review session had been scheduled, not a meeting, a hearing. I wasn't in the room when it happened. That had been decided in advance to maintain separation between the audit and the disciplinary process. Instead, I sat in a smaller office down the hall with a live feed connected to the main conference room. It was enough. I didn't need to be physically present to understand what was unfolding. When the session began, the tone was controlled, procedural. Compliance opened with a structured summary of the findings, outlining discrepancies without assigning intent, just facts placed in sequence. My mother sat at the table, composed, posture straight, expression unchanged. If someone had walked in without context, they would have assumed it was routine. That changed when the memo appeared on the screen. I watched her eyes shift just slightly, enough to register recognition. Compliance asked her to explain the origin of the document. She answered without hesitation. It was part of a collaborative framework developed with external input, she said. The same language she had used with me, controlled, adaptable, designed to diffuse responsibility. Then the metadata appeared. The timestamp, the workstation ID, the access logs, each layer removed a piece of the explanation she was relying on. For the first time, she paused before responding. Not long, but long enough to signal that the narrative she had prepared no longer aligned with what was being presented. The sequence moved faster after that. Expense reports tied to the memo were displayed, each one connected through the same pattern of adjusted classifications and shortened approval paths. Campaign credit reassignment logs followed, showing how contributions had been shifted after results were finalized. Individually, each action might have been explained. Together, they formed a structure that couldn't be separated from intent. When the external fund transfers were introduced, the tone in the room changed. Not visibly, but in a way that carried weight. The kind of shift that happens when something crosses from questionable into serious. My mother adjusted her approach. I could see it in the way she leaned forward, her tone shifting from explanation to justification. These decisions were made to maintain operational stability, she said. Certain reallocations were necessary to prevent larger failures. It was a strategic move, reframing intent as necessity, positioning the actions as protective rather than exploitative. For a moment, it almost held. Then Richard spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He redirected. Stability doesn't require falsifying documentation, he said, and it doesn't require using someone else's identity to validate decisions they weren't part of. The room went quiet again, not because of the volume, but because of the clarity. There was no space left to reinterpret what was being shown. The final evidence closed everything. Access logs tied to the memo aligned with her keycard entry into the building. The recorded client call placed me somewhere else at the exact same time. Two independent systems confirming the same reality. When compliance summarized the findings, the language shifted. No longer observational, determinative, gross misconduct, unauthorized use of company resources, misrepresentation of authorship, financial misallocation. Each term carried a weight that couldn't be softened. The decision came without delay. Termination effective immediately. Full repayment of misused funds pending review. Referral to external legal counsel for further investigation. There was no argument, no visible resistance. My mother didn't push back. She sat there, still composed, but something about her presence had changed. Not physically, structurally. The system that had supported her version of reality was no longer there to reinforce it. I watched until the feed ended, not because I needed confirmation, but because I wanted to understand what it looked like when control shifted completely. There was no dramatic collapse, no visible breakdown, just a gradual removal of the layers that had protected her from consequence. One by one, they disappeared until there was nothing left to redirect the outcome. When the screen went dark, I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel victory. What I felt was quieter than that. A release. The kind that comes when something that has been held in place for too long finally moves. Not all at once, but enough to change the structure around it. For the first time since the wedding, I wasn't thinking about how I had been seen. I was thinking about what had been proven. Not to them, not even to the company, but to myself. That the version of me they had built their narrative around wasn't fixed. It had been constructed. And once you understand how something is built, you can dismantle it. By the time I left the building that evening, the outcome had already started to move beyond that room. Access was being restricted, processes were being reviewed, conversations were shifting, the company would rebuild. That part was inevitable, but the version of reality my mother had controlled for years no longer had a structure to hold it in place. And without that structure, it couldn't survive the same way anymore. 3 weeks after everything came out, my aunt invited me to dinner, and I almost didn't go. The message was short, careful, the kind of wording people use when they know something needs to be said but don't know how it will land. "It's time we talk honestly," she wrote. That line stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because I believed it, but because it suggested something had shifted. This wasn't before the truth. This was after. So I went. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. Warm lighting, polished furniture, everything arranged to feel stable, predictable, untouched. But the people inside it were different. My parents were already seated when I walked in, their posture rigid in a way that felt unfamiliar. My father looked up first, then away, like he wasn't sure what version of me he was supposed to acknowledge. My mother sat perfectly still, her expression controlled, but quieter than I had ever seen it. Not defeated, just contained. Like she no longer had the space to expand into the narrative she used to control. Dinner started the way these things always do, with conversations that didn't matter. Weather, work, small details designed to delay what everyone knew was coming. No one wanted to be the first to shift the tone. My aunt did it anyway. She set her glass down, looked directly at my parents, and said, "We're not here to pretend nothing happened." The room didn't react dramatically. It just settled into something real for the first time. She began listing things I had done over the years, not as accusations, but as facts that had never been acknowledged. The times I stepped in quietly to fix problems that weren't mine. The money I had given without being asked publicly. The opportunities I had created for others while being removed from the outcome. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't soften it. She just said it the way it had always been. My cousins shifted in their seats. My father's expression tightened. My mother didn't look up. Then she said the part that had been hidden the longest. The education fund. The one created in my name and redirected without my knowledge. She didn't frame it as a misunderstanding. She didn't ask for explanation. She stated it as a fact, a decision made, a transfer executed, a benefit reassigned. The silence that followed wasn't avoidance. It was recognition, the kind that doesn't leave space for reinterpretation. My father spoke first. His voice was controlled, but there was something under it that hadn't been there before. Not authority, not certainty. "We did what we thought was best," he said. "We made decisions based on who needed the support to succeed." It was the same logic, just without the confidence that had once made it unquestionable. My mother finally spoke after a moment, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "You didn't need it," she said, still not looking at me. "You always figured things out on your own." That was when everything settled into place in a way it never had before. Not because it was new, but because it was finally said without being disguised as something else. I didn't interrupt. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just listened. Because for the first time, I didn't need them to understand me. I just needed to understand what had always been true. "I'm not here to fix this," I said finally. My voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. "I'm here because this is the last time I'm going to be part of this version of the story." That was the only line that mattered. Not emotional, not dramatic, just final. They tried to respond after that. My father reframing, my mother starting to speak, then stopping when the words didn't land the way they used to. But I didn't engage. There was nothing left to negotiate. I had spent years adjusting myself to fit into something that was never built for me. I wasn't doing that anymore. I left before dessert. No confrontation, no closing speech. I stood up, picked up my coat, and walked out the same way I had walked out of that wedding, quietly, without asking permission. The air outside felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. Like something that had been pressing against me for years had finally stepped back far enough for me to see it for what it was. 6 months later, my life doesn't resemble the version they used to describe. The contract turned into a long-term advisory role with equity tied to the systems I helped rebuild. I hired a small team, expanded my work, and for the first time, attached my name directly to what I had always done behind the scenes. Not for validation, but for accuracy. My work existed, my contribution was visible, and the structure around it reflected that. I changed my number, filtered my email, removed myself from every space where my presence had always been conditional. There was no announcement, no explanation, just a shift in access. The same kind of shift I had traced in systems before, only this time it applied to my own life. They still exist, their narrative still exists, but it no longer includes me. If there's one thing I learned, it's that silence can be more powerful than confrontation when it comes from clarity. I didn't destroy anything. I didn't take anything from them that wasn't already unstable. I just stopped reinforcing a version of reality that required me to disappear in order to work. And once I stepped out of it, it couldn't hold the same shape anymore. So I'll leave you with this. If you've ever been placed into a role that never felt like yours, if you've ever been told who you are in a way that didn't match what you knew to be true, at what point do you stop trying to prove them wrong and start choosing yourself instead? If this story felt familiar in any way, I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments, because someone else reading it might need to see that they're not alone. And if you want more stories like this, stories about boundaries, clarity, and turning the tables without losing yourself in the process, make sure you stay with the channel and subscribe. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.